Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to have you all here with Professor David Gentilcore. I'm Francesca Tarocco, and I'm the director of NICHE, the Center for Environmental Humanities here at Foscari, University of Venice. And today we are gathering in presence and online, hello everyone online, for our annual lecture. And our very own, I dare say, Professor Gentilcore has agreed to talk about his recent research on the water cultures of Italy. So a few words about David Gentilcore. He's professor of early modern history in the Department of Humanities here at Foscari, and from the very beginning, member of the Scientific Advisory Board of NICHE. I want to say that in a range of compelling essays and books, David has explored the areas where the history of health and healing, popular religion, the history of food, and social and cultural history come together, with a focus on Italy and more recently on water, which is why we asked him to give our annual lecture. As you know, our center does a lot of water studies or tries to do that. In 2008, his book Medical Charlatanism in Early Modern Italy was awarded the Royal Society of Canada's Dr. Jason Hanna Medal, and in 2012 he was awarded the Salvatore De Renzi International Prize for his contribution to the history of medicine by the University of Salerno Medical School. Professor Gentilcore has held visiting professorship at McMaster in Canada, at Villa Itati, the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence, and visiting fellowships at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of London and many other places. He has recently been the recipient of an advanced ERC grant for the water cultures of Italy, but he's also been awarded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Wellcome Institute, the Wellcome Trust, and the Leverhulme Trust, and so on. Among his many publications, I want to mention, and he's going to hate me for that, Pomodoro, a book that actually historicized, tomato and the diet, as well as the symbolic order associated with it. And then we have Food and Health in Early Modern Europe, and more recently, the magnificent I disegni e I discorsi di Giovanni Antonio Nigrone, Fontanaro e Ingegnero de Acqua, a beautifully illustrated open access series of essays co-authored with Gaia Bruno. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for that lovely introduction. Yeah, I was once referred to by someone as a tomato historian, which is kind of a weird label. So let me just figure this out. Yes, so thank you very much for the kind invitation. Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk a bit about the project, about some of the findings we had, and maybe even try to decide whether we've actually met our goals. But behind the project, Water Cultures, lies a paradox. Water, although vital for life, has historically been of little intrinsic value compared to, say, gold or whatever. And this paradox is voiced, let me just see it, beautiful, by this fellow here, a well-traveled French Dominican, Jean-Baptiste Labat, active in the early decades of the 18th century. Labat wasn't only a man of many talents, clergyman, architect, technician, military man, administrator. He was also a pretty good narrator, a storyteller. When captured by the Spanish, somewhere in the Caribbean, I think, and offered water to drink aboard ship, he replied to his captors, "Only invalids and chickens drink water in my country." At the same time, the multi-volume travelogue, memoir, Natural History of Italy and Spain that he wrote, positively abounds with detailed references to water and its life-giving properties. Every place he visits, Labat describes the nature of the freshwater supply, the varied techniques used to harvest, store, and access it. He's impressed by the technology of water, the ornamental fountains, miraculous springs, the medical uses of water, disputes over water rights, and the taste of particular waters. And he gets so carried away by his instructions on how to construct a rainwater cistern that he repeats them in 2 separate books. So the question we're asking is, what would a history of a society look like with water placed at its core? Biologically, we need water to survive. Culturally, water represents the strongest and most evident point of intersection between the history of nature and the history of humankind. It's at the foundation of all society, and for this reason, its use and the meanings given it provide the key lens through which to understand any society. For the Canadian geographer Jamie Linton, I like to cite fellow Canadians whenever I can, the history of water is a story of how people have drawn meanings, ideas, representations, and powers from water. The aim of the project, Water Cultures, is to create a new approach to the study of human actions with water over time. It proposes to write the history and culture of a given society based on its changing relationships with water, the ways of controlling it, using it, conceiving it, the religious, symbolic, knowledge dimensions that it assumes, and the forms of cultural production it leads to. And by water cultures, always sort of in inverted commas there, I mean both the material aspects, so think, I don't know, hydraulic engineering, aqueducts, that sort of thing, as well as the non-material, symbolic responses, religious beliefs and practices, expertise, knowledge, legislation. I designed the project to consist of different research areas, which I called streams. It works nicely in English. And the streams, well, I'll just go through them. I won't bore you. There are 5 of them. The idea, though, is that they're meant to interact, inform one another, especially, let's say, the science and health of water is one that's meant to inform all the others. Supplying Italian cities, also rural areas. I only took this picture a few years ago, but already all those olive trees are dead. That's another story. And then occupations. So the hypothesis of the project is that by interweaving an understanding of these separate streams, separate themes, separate disciplines, they can shed light on one another, inform one another, but also enter into some kind of transformative multi-strand dialogue. I'm quoting from my application there, obviously. Why Italy? Well, okay, the easy answer is I'm an Italian historian, so yeah, what would you expect me to do? But I can justify it. First of all, because of the unparalleled wealth of Italy's archives, Italy's rich print history. Also climatically, if we go from the high Alps in the north with abundant rainfall down to the parsed islands of the Mediterranean in the south, the peninsula, the islands of Italy offer a range of sharp geographic and climatic contrasts, as well as the millennia of human responses to the diverse challenges that these pose. And then finally, as you can see from the map on the left, is the range of political forms in Italy's patchwork of independent and semi-independent states before unification. We have a monarchy, a theocracy, all kinds of duchies, and a republic, of course. So it's kind of a microcosm of early modern Europe. And then the stresses and strains caused by the movement for unification, the attempts to forge a new political and social identity. All of this allows for or should encourage a comparative approach, which is kind of unusual in the study of Italian history, where things tend to be local and regional. And then we like to do this over a longue durée, sort of an extended time period, to take in the early and late modern periods, which allows us, I think, to track changes and continuities, local variations, as well as regional patterns. I've just put a few examples relative to Venice to give an idea of the range of things that happen over this long period. So, what have we actually been doing as a team? There are 9 of us, postdocs and PhD candidates. So, what I thought is I would just give you a few sort of case studies by way of example. So, the first cluster of things we've been working on is approaches to understanding water in the period and how that determines the way water is used. Beginning with drinking water. Drinking water is kind of an obsession of mine. I'm not necessarily drinking this stuff, but historically, because it's potentially element, and medicament. And I also like the fact that drinking water, at least in English, can refer both to the act of consuming it, but also the stuff itself. We generally assume, if we think about it at all, that people in the past probably didn't drink the water. They regarded it as too unsafe, too risky, generally unhealthy. But I think this assumption is flawed because it's based on a lack of evidence, or at least an apparent lack of evidence. You have to look a bit harder. And so as a contribution to filling this gap, I've tried to explore what I found to be, actually, the changing nature of medical advice and medical practice regarding the consumption of water, drinking water, and what it can tell us about the place of water in society over this time. So to start off with, I looked at a genre known in English as dietaries or regimens. These are books of essentially guides to staying healthy and living a long life. Who doesn't want that? So you can imagine it was very successful. These are books published in the vernacular languages in cheap editions, essentially telling you what to eat, what to drink, how to eat it, how to drink, and in order to stay healthy. They all have a chapter on water, which is what kind of drew me to them. So they can help us understand how the advice changes, how knowledge about water, or at least understanding of water, changes over the period in the context of regulating one's own food and drink intake. And in them, we see, or at least I've been able to uncover, a complete shift. Water goes from being considered, and I quote from one of them, the vilest of beverages. This is from the 1450s, this text. The consumption of which, though necessary, had to be carefully regulated, goes from that to being considered a universal medicine some 300 years later, able to prevent and cure disease. And in the process, wine gives way to water as the preferred healthy drink, for these doctors at least. Probably not for their patients, but that's another question. Let me just briefly discuss one example to give you an idea what I mean. And this is from a book by a Bolognese physician, Baldassare Pisanelli. And it deals, as you can see from the title, with the regulation of food and drink in the prevention of individual health. Pisanelli doesn't consider water a food because it doesn't nourish the body. It doesn't nourish the body because it can't become blood. That's how it was for Renaissance physicians. Rather, he says it's a vehicle of food because it brings nourishment throughout the body. Pisanelli goes on to extol the precious nature of water and the infinite benefits it brings us. So this is water as element. But he's all too aware that the perceived qualities of water, as cold and damp, light and non-nutritious, present serious problems for the human organism. And this is water as element. So as a result, Pisanelli places serious restrictions to limit the damage that drinking water could cause. So you should never drink water on an empty stomach when there's nothing to digest. And if you're thirsty at night, then moistening your mouth will have to suffice. Oh, and you shouldn't drink water on a full stomach either, because water harms the head, the brain, the nerves, and alienates the mind. That's madness. Simply put, so I'll summarize, avoid drinking water when you're thirsty. Fast forward to 1712, and this fellow here, Friedrich Hoffmann, is a German physician from Halle. He's the first to propose common water as a universal medicine to prevent and cure disease. The properties of drinking water are seen by Hoffmann in a mechanistic guise. It's a new model of the body. So if the body is a hydraulic machine, as it was for Hoffmann, composed of solid and fluid particles, then flow is essential to the functioning and good health of the organism. For Hoffmann, water keeps the blood fluid, increases the appetite, purifies the intestines, transports nourishment throughout the body, ensures clarity, that's mental clarity, and keeps your teeth clean, thus preventing disease. He who drinks water, Hoffmann suggests, provided it's pure and excellent, is healthier and longer lived than he who drinks wine. You have been warned. So, now I thought, oh, what happened? That's the theory, right? This is advice to people who are healthy to stay healthy. What if you're sick? You know? What about medical therapeutics, medical practice? So we can find out something about this by looking at medical consultations. These are actual sessions between a physician and a patient, real treatment, advice given to real patients suffering from real diseases. And to get an idea, I want to compare briefly these two doctors here. They're different chronologically, medically, geographically. The guy on the left is Epifanio Ferdinando. He's from Mesagne in Puglia. He's typical of late Renaissance neo-Galenic medicine. The guy on the right is Francesco Torti. He's from Modena, and he's typical of the mechanical medicine of the early 18th century. So not too much in terms of time, not much separates the two. But they're completely different in the way they reason, the way they view the body. Ferdinando accepted that he accepted the consumption of water for its role in digestion and to dilute wine, so pretty much as Pisanelli said. But otherwise, he severely limited and circumscribed its use. Far from constituting a part of medical therapeutics for Ferdinando, drinking water, especially cold water, actually caused a variety of illnesses, either as a single cause or in combination with other factors. So drinking water for him was something best avoided. Then Torti, just over 100 years later, he represents something of a small revolution. He considered drinking water to be a crucial part of a healthy daily regimen and used its consumption to treat a range of illnesses. 300 of his medical consultations survive. Most of them contain a reference to drinking water as part of a regimen for the patient or as a medicine used to treat the patient. And this is in line, in fact, in one of his consultations, he talks about the body in terms of a hydraulic pneumatic mechanism, body as machine, where liquids and solids were both responsible for the functioning of the body, with the liquids being most important. And so from this, it makes sense that they should think water might be useful. All of the doctors agreed on one thing, well, especially Hoffman and Torti. The water consumed had to be pure, which invites the question, what did pre-modern societies understand about water quality? And how would this have been monitored and managed? So one of the topics that several members of the water cultures team have been looking at is the changing notion of water quality and how this was ascertained, what impact it had on society. And it brings together the different streams that I just rushed through on the science and health of water, the supplying of Italian cities, and the occupations relating to water. But to answer that question, I first need to say something about how people understood water more generally. From antiquity, every water was different. The important distinction between our tendency to use the word in the singular, especially in English, and the pre-modern idea of waters in the plural reflects a much deeper difference in the way water was perceived. The modern scientific abstraction, that is the molecular formula H2O, is radically different from the classical notion of each manifestation of water as unique. Unique in its properties, unique in its characteristics, unique in its effects. Especially important for Renaissance doctors was this book by Hippocrates, the ancient physician, called Airs, Waters, and Places. That's the title most often given it. And it dealt with waters in their plurality. Hippocrates emphasizes the effects of different waters on bodies, their influences on the cultures of peoples around the known world, sort of thing. But probably there's no better early modern example of this plurality, of this approach. This chappie here, Francesco Redi. If you've heard of Redi at all, it might be for his Bacco in Toscana, Bacchus in Tuscany. I don't know. Anyway, it's an epic poem in praise of the many different wines of Tuscany. So if you're a wine fan, you'll have heard of it. But what you won't have heard of, probably, is the companion piece to it, which is called Arianna Inferma, or Ariadne Sickened. You'll never have heard of the latter because it was never published. Only fragments survive. So in Bacco in Toscana, Bacchus and his consort, Ariadne, take an imagined, that's them on the left there, take an imagined tour of the Grand Duchy, imbibing the wines as they go. And whilst the Redi has Bacchus sing the praises of a wide range of wines, their differing qualities and benefits, and get quite drunk in the process, he has his consort, Ariadne, praise a variety of waters in response in the Arianna Inferma. Now, Redi's Ariadne isn't really ill. She's just suffering from a very bad hangover. And she says in the poem, one that has made me so parched, I could drink a whole well. And we get a sense of Redi's enthusiasm for ordinary, common local waters in the surviving fragments that make up the Arianna Inferma. So the waters of Fiesole and the Arno and Tiber rivers are mentioned, as is the Pimentera spring outside Lisbon. Ariadne describes in loving detail the qualities of the spring at the Medici Villa of Pratolino, but reserves her greatest praise for the waters of Siena's Fontebranda fountain, for which she would gladly exchange all the casks of Valdarno and Chianti wines. Yeah, We can only imagine what Redi might have said about other well-known waters from around Tuscany and beyond had the full poem survived. I would have loved that, but there you go. Redi's literary accomplishments were informed by his everyday medical practice, but also by his scientific investigations, because in addition to being a medical practitioner, a natural philosopher, Medici court physician, writer, poet, as we've just seen, Redi is regarded as one of the pioneers of the scientific method, in particular the controlled experiment. Team member Oscar Schiavone has been delving into how Redi's appreciation for water came about. When the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Vittoria della Rovere, traveled to the Bagni di Lucca to take the baths in 1669, Redi was one of the many people who accompanied her. But he didn't just twiddle his thumbs whilst the Grand Duchess did what Grand Duchesses do. Rather, he initiated a series of experiments, which he recorded in a previously unknown notebook of chemical experiences on water. And so Oscar's been researching this notebook, and he's been seeking to reconstruct Redi's motivations, his methodology, his attempts to assert scientific authority through repeated trials on water that combined sensory experience with systematic chemical investigation. And he's been able to demonstrate a paradox that I found when looking at Redi's medical consultations, which is about the specificity of local waters at the same time as having them be interchangeable. It seems a paradox, but it's something we still have to work at. All of this in the nascent field of chemistry. And as I've been discovering, the plurality of waters manifests itself in early modern approaches to water quality, where quality essentially refers to a water's prominent physical characteristics, its composition. Jean-François says that although all waters are of the same substance, they differ from each other in their qualities and mixtures. And this difference between different waters makes them relatively good or relatively bad, and it determines their uses by human beings. So it's kind of a sliding scale of waters. Now, we might expect him to begin with the purest of waters, but for Francois, pure waters don't exist in nature. All waters have some kind of mixture derived through their contact with the environment. And when it came to drinking water, and this is kind of counterintuitive, he says that absolute purity is not the aim. Indeed, if it were pure, it wouldn't have been able to serve as food for either human beings or animals. So good quality water, for Francois, was neither too pure nor too mixed. Rather, it had to be balanced, like the fabric or temperament of our bodies. So in this sliding scale of water quality, waters which didn't meet the high standards, say, of drinking water, still had other human uses, and they're equally as important. And this is why it's important to determine the quality of the water, to ascertain it, because that determines their uses. So a little bit later, Bergman mentions a whole range of trades, from brewing and baking, washing, dyeing clothes, to tanning and paper making. The quality of the water employed is of so much consequence, he says, that unless one be chosen fit for the purpose, the whole process fails. Sailors, bakers, washerwomen all preferred rainwater because it kept best, whereas builders and plasterers, he says, preferred harder waters because they gave firmness and stability to the mortar. Venice provides an interesting example of these ambiguities. One of the largest and most economically vibrant of early modern cities, Venice, as you probably know, was uniquely dependent on rainwater capture for all of its freshwater needs. Rainwater fed thousands of underground wells located in the city's campi, in courtyards, private houses, religious institutions. Well, these aren't wells, technically, because they don't tap groundwater, which would have been brackish anyway. Rather, they're complex devices for capturing, filtering, the sand layer, and then storing rainwater, poor access. The quality of the water in these pozzi was generally, had a good reputation, and not just amongst Venetians. And I thought, well, how can that be? It doesn't seem. Rainwater is reputed amongst the best of waters, so okay, that's good. And then sand is considered perfect for filtering. So any bad stuff that the rainwater accumulates by falling through the heavens gets filtered out by the sand. It then gets deposited under the wellhead. Perfect. What more could you ask for? There are lots of examples of people visiting Venice, waxing lyrical about the quality of the water, including this guy here, Thomas Coriat. He's a great example. I mean, I'll just mention him because he left England on foot for a tour of France and Italy. Just the fact that he's going on foot, I think, is great. And he gets to Venice, and what does he meet? One of these people on the left, a courtesan. Wow, nothing like that in his native Somerset. Wow. And he gives us the first descriptions in English of the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto, of the table fork, English have never heard of this thing, and the umbrella. And he also describes the wells. He's really impressed by them, especially the two large wells, the ornate ones in the courtyard of the Ducal Palace. Maybe you've seen them. He remarks that they yield very pleasant water, for I tasted it. There you go. When it comes to Venetians, the physician Andrea Marini also singled out the importance of the well's sand layer in filtering rainwater. But Marini was also the first to warn of the dangers posed by acqua alta, by the exceptionally high tides. He's writing in 1559. The November before, in 1558, had been a particularly bad episode of acqua alta. With the result, he says, that these flooded ground floor rooms with a mixture of salt water and waste, remembering that the canals were also sewers, which lead, and I quote, to putrefaction of the air and spoiling of the waters in the cisterns, from which originate very serious illnesses. But the authorities didn't just stand by. They intervened in three ways, in increasing order of magnitude and cost. First of all, prevention. They sought to ensure the good quality of the water going into the well cistern, so keeping the campi clean and things like that. They also engaged in remedial action, like the pumping out and refilling of the well cisterns following episodes of acqua alta, so I've been able to document how often this happens, how much it costs, all that sort of thing. And then finally, by pro-action, which consisted of the regular maintenance of the well cisterns themselves. And this was the costliest measure of all. The whole program of structural maintenance and reconstruction of public well cisterns, which also extended to new builds, completely new wells. And this was a program carried out throughout the 18th century. In 1831, the city's health officers ordered an inspection of all of the city's public wells, parish by parish, to determine, and I quote, the extent of the works and the perfection of the waters. This is applied to all public wells, whether they'd been just repaired or reconstructed or newly built. The inspection was carried out to test the quality of the water in each well, but also to test the quality of the manufacture of the structure of the wells themselves. And if approved, they would be inspected, and if approved, a payment would be issued. So the people undertaking the work wouldn't get paid until the quality was good. The quality of the water was tested by a physician, an apothecary, and a dyer, who were to examine, taste, and trial each water. And we have some reports that survive about that. So that there's a direct link here between contemporary notions of water quality and the hydraulic infrastructure of the city. And throughout the rest of the 18th century, almost all of Venice's public wells, which eventually numbered 157, just in case you were curious, were either restored, rebuilt, or new ones constructed. And this included, as in this plan here of Santa Maria Formosa, of raising the level of entire campi, by about half a meter, sometimes more, to lessen the risk of water flooding into the wells during episodes of acqua alta. And this is work that, it's a huge square. It costs tens of thousands of ducats, and this whole program of works, most of the public wells in the city were raised up in this way, which is just an immense task. And the water routinely tested, the water in the wells routinely tested. And this was a century or more before water testing became routine in other urban realities. I don't know, Paris, London, that sort of thing. Have no idea what the water tasted like, what we would make of it. But what's striking for a historian is how, well into the 19th century, concepts such as drinkability remained relative, likely to vary from place to place. In a recent article, another team member, Salvatore Valenti, begins in 1868 when the Venice Town Council was discussing several projects aimed at bringing additional water to Venice by means of an aqueduct. Engineer Demetrio Busoni, he was later president of the Ateneo Veneto. Anyway, he wanted the council to adopt a very precise criterion for measuring the quality of the source of the water that was going to be brought via aqueduct, rather than some kind of generic concept of potability. Busoni asked, who can tell me what potable water means? Who can tell me when a water becomes undrinkable and when it stops being drinkable? Because I don't think potability or drinkability is a well-defined concept. Because water that is quite drinkable in Venice will almost certainly be rejected in Rome, and a water that is here considered undrinkable might be drunk elsewhere. In other words, water quality was still perceived as being site-specific in a way that was linked with local habits and preferences. So throughout our period, 1500 to 1900 again, and to quote Salvo, the perception of water was influenced by general patterns of thinking, beliefs, social dynamics, political institutions, economic interests, and material objects. What constituted good drinking water varied across time, space, societies, and cultures, as well as amongst individuals. Now, water wasn't just for drinking, it was essential for all kinds of other uses, some of which we've been looking at as a team. In the early modern period, up until steam basically, water is the main source of power in manufacturing and industry. Used to turn mill wheels, and this mill wheels went far beyond just turning wheat into flour, because mills were used for a whole range of manufacturing purposes. Consider the mill proposed to the Venetian authorities in 1559 by an engineer named Giovanni Battista Antonella. He's applying for a patent. He says it's powered by river, spring, or tide, and it could, according to Antonelli, perform a variety of activities: grinding flour, pressing olives, refining sugar, polishing weapons, grinding gunpowder, making paper, tanning leather, milling wood, draining ditches and marshes, fulling cloth, and irrigating vineyards. But it gives you an idea of just all the things that mills could do, mills powered by water. And irrigation. Speaking of irrigation, team members Lavinia Madaluno and Rachele Scuro are currently editing a volume on a history of rice cultivation, commerce, and consumption, with the focus on Italy, although it goes a bit beyond. Rice is a very thirsty crop, and Rachele's contribution in particular focuses on the spread of rice cultivation in the Venetian mainland state. This is seen through its relationship with water management. It begins in 1522 with an attempt to boost rice cultivation. The Council of Ten in that year decreed an exemption on taxes and duties for people cultivating rice. And then in the middle of the century, the Republic stipulated new centralized water policies. The result of this was that both families and institutions invested in rice cultivation, turned their lands over to rice cultivation. But this had the knock-on effect of generating disputes over access to the all-important water. Historians love disputes because they provide documentation for what we do. And Rachele is investigating the role played by the privatization of water access rights, the relationship with the creation of new paddy fields, all of this in an attempt to study the evolution of the production of food and raw materials in the early modern Venetian state. And this kind of research, you can see, brings together the streams on the occupations of water, as well as the hydraulic landscape, both urban and rural. And Rachele's co-editor, Lavinia, is also working on one of the topics very dear to the Water Cultures Project, and that's sanitation. Sanitation. The removal of waste, human waste mostly. It's often seen as the flip side of freshwater provision. In urban history, for example, the two are often studied together. Two sides of the same coin. Lavinia's investigations into the latrines and water cisterns of 18th century Milan reveal a bewildering, colorful array of occupations. Physicians and chemists were essential in assessing the salubrity of various sites with stagnant water in both urban and rural areas. We have engineers who produced extensive reports on the material aspects of this infrastructure. Masons repaired the walls of the latrines when their waste infiltrated nearby houses, or even worse, in the wells. The spazzapozzi, as their name suggests, cleaned the wells. The navacciari, as here, collected putrid water and organic waste, basically, from cisterns and latrines, and they then sealed them in these containers, which were called navacce, and deposited them, in theory, into Milan's sewers. I'm sure they also went out to the fields, but we haven't. Anyway, and fine, let's see. We've also got the trombai. Mustn't forget them, because they were artisans armed with devices to pump water out of the wells. So looking at all of these occupations, Lavinia's been able to explore how the knowledge of this infrastructure in Milan was collectively constructed and the role of individual responsibility in its functioning. So I could talk about sanitation for hours. I even thought of abbreviating the project water cultures to WC just to get the point across. But I won't. I'll finish by talking about another case study, quite different case study. In 1549, the bodies of 4 men, and I'm quoting, 4 men murdered and full of wounds, were found in the deep underground reservoirs that supplied most of the city of Naples with its water. In the teeming city, then amongst Europe's largest, it seems that this underground, these water reservoirs were a popular place to dump corpses, because 2 years later, the body of a dead child was found. Then in 1553, the body of, and I quote again, a woman covered with wounds so decomposed that it was impossible to identify her. And then finally in 1556, a man and a woman likewise murdered and decomposed. I tried to get this with AI, but it doesn't go into decomposed, rotting bodies. I don't know why. So nothing. Anyway, so this might seem fairly gruesome, something like a Scandi noir set in Naples. But our source for all this is a manuscript by Giovanni Antonio Nigrone, compiled at the end of the 16th century. Nigrone refers to himself as a fontanaro et ingegnero de acqua, or a fountaineer and engineer of water. Obviously, having rotting, decomposing corpses in your water supply is not a good thing, so it's his job to intervene. It comes from a section of his manuscript where he describes the structure and functioning of this immense hydraulic system. It reflects the expertise of someone who knew it firsthand. Team member Gaia Bruno has painstakingly transcribed and edited Nigrone's precious manuscript. It's in 2 volumes, now in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Naples. And together we organized an international conference on Nigrone and his work, and then published the resulting essays, which are on the left there. All of this is in open access. We don't know much about Nigrone. The Fontanari were municipal employees in the city. They worked for what was called the Tribunale della Fortificazione Acqua e Mattonata, which oversaw the condition and maintenance of the city's infrastructure, its roads, its fortification, and its water supply. So it's an important part of civic government there. But there's no way of documenting in what capacity Nigrone worked for the Tribunale, because like much else in this enigmatic manuscript, we have only Nigrone's word to go by. The 2 volumes are called Vari Disegni and Vari Discorsi. These are the ones that the librarians have given them, and they are varied. The discorsi are essays covering a bewildering array of different topics, from volcanic eruptions and earthquakes to cosmology and astrology, from the 4 elements to the 6 ages of the world, from baths and thermal springs to esoteric recipes, from the history of Naples to meteorology. Oh yeah, and not forgetting the subject of horns as a consolation to cuckolds everywhere. Not surprisingly, given his occupation, Nigrone also discourses at length on water-related matters. The quality of different waters for human health, the leveling necessary to channel waters, the siting and digging of wells, how to store water, how to locate water hidden underground. And just as many discourses could have been linked or were linked to the practice of his profession in Naples, working for the municipal authorities. the different qualities of water in underground cisterns, the measures used in the sale of water, concessions in the city, and so on and so on. And looking at these two volumes, the essays in them seem at first like a hodgepodge, a random collection of information copied from a wide range of printed sources, put together randomly. But closer inspection reveals a degree of internal organization where certain themes lead to one another, or he refers you to another essay, things like that. The themes covered reflect Negrone's professional and cultural interests based on materials taken from other sources, sometimes re-elaborated by Negrone, sometimes just copied out verbatim. Sometimes there's original material, especially when these are linked to his own professional activities. He writes in a language that is, our language expert tells me, pre-Renaissance, non-standardized Tuscan, although what is apparent to everyone is it's just full of Neapolitan words. He spells words sometimes in an Italian way, sometimes in a Neapolitan way, but most of his vocabulary is Neapolitan, whether that's everyday kinds of words or more technical ones. Oh yeah, and he doesn't know Latin either. Negrone seems most comfortable when it comes to learning and knowledge in his own field. I guess that's not surprising, field of hydraulics. And here there's the most evidence of him testing, selecting, testing, transforming even traditional learning. As Guy has stressed, Negrone credits himself here with suggesting improvements to certain mechanical water lifting devices like the pump that he claims to have developed for the city, the well of the city's incurables hospital. It's a well located very deep in the ground, so he has to solve the problem of how to bring the water up. What has struck historians, especially art historians, garden historians over the years, is the hundreds, there's something like 300 designs for ornamental fountains. Many of these he claims to have realized for members of the aristocracy and the ecclesiastical elites of his day, both inside and beyond Naples. So the kingdom's Spanish viceroy, Pedro de Toledo, the Bishop of Iquiquense, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and no less than two popes, Sixtus V and Gregory III. In his fountain designs, Negrone demonstrates how he is happy to appropriate ancient hydraulic technology, but in the process transforming it, taking it further. So here we have one where he's giving us water spouting soldiers, castles, a whole miniature town complete with moving figures, ringing church bells, rotating windmills, running streams. This is something apparently made of terracotta and painted lead, which he did for the Prince of Avellino in 1606. He says it's too beautiful to put on paper, but he does it anyway. Anyway, it's beautiful on paper too. It's a complex scenography teeming with life. It reminds me a bit of a Neapolitan nativity scene, from later on anyway. All of his fountain designs are richly colored, beguiling. They're a triumph of reds and blues and greens and yellows, with a range of types and motifs. And he's a unique witness to an important phase in the evolution of garden culture in Renaissance Italy. And not just because he was so active, but also because he actively copied from other sources, which kind of suggests what might have been popular at the time. But it also reminds us that we have to take his claims of authorship with a pinch of salt. So we have to take his authorship at face value. We mustn't take his authorship at face value. Yeah, sorry about that. So what can we learn from someone like Negrone, someone who's a bit shifty, a bit disreputable? Well, I think one thing we can learn is about fountain fashion and garden fashion during the latter part of the 16th century. Because people like Negrone are tailoring their wares to suit an expanding clientele. Everybody wants a water feature, right? Okay, they can't afford expensive marble, but Negrone can deliver you something made out of less conventional materials: shells, corals, mosaics, colored and painted stucco, clay. And these elements not only suited contemporary taste, they were also a lot cheaper. So this might be part of a strategy on the part of Negrone, of which the manuscript was an additional part. But what was that strategy? I mean, what explains the rich detail of the manuscript, its range, but also this enigmatic and contradictory quality where he mixes ingenuity with imitation, original insight with stale pedantry? What can explain his exaggerated or even false claims, the way he copied without attribution? Well, Negrone wouldn't be the first artisan or professional, or even historian for that matter, to overstate his abilities or copy from the work of others. The manuscript was a part of his strategy of professional and social self-promotion, a means of enticing potential clients. So maybe the fountain designs, at least, weren't meant to be representations of real fountains or necessarily even proposals for their execution. Rather, they might have been part of a portfolio, a sample book, which he used to consolidate his reputation and advertise his services. And in this way, Negrone is actually interesting for his very ordinariness, enveloped in this kind of, what shall we say, aspirational posturing. He exemplifies a middling sort of knowledge, a very practical expertise. Someone interested in the kinds of popular books that circulated in print at the time and the knowledge that they contained, just as his fountain designs give us an idea of what was fashionable. In short, Negrone helps us understand the Italy of his day. The anthropologist and friend of Niche, I have to say, Veronica Strang, has written that, and I quote, "Water is not merely a physical resource. In every cultural context, it's densely encoded with social, spiritual, political, and environmental meanings." As a research program, I haven't had much to say about the spiritual today, but as a research program, the Water Cultures Project, as a group, we've tried to decode and explore some of these meanings in the context of early and late modern Italy. As I said at the outset, I don't really have any definitive answers yet, but I hope at least I've succeeded in giving you a taste of what history might look like with water at its core. Thank you very much. And all the stuff I've cited, all the works are, you can go to our website and they're all in open access. If you haven't had enough by now.
Thank you, David, for a very rich and generous and wonderful lecture. And I know that you're happy to take some questions both from people online, thank you there, and people in the room. So we have about 20 minutes or so. So please go ahead. I have many questions myself. Yes, a drink of water. Anyone? I have a question. Shall I?
Yeah, sure.
So I study a place where water tends to be boiled. You know, so there's, in fact, a book written by the late Marco Ceresa with a wonderful title, The Discovery of Hot Water, La Scoperta dell'Acqua Calda, right? So was it, and that's China, of course, you know, and China is obsessed by boiling water and, of course, tea and so on and so forth. So I wonder, what about that? I mean, the water you talk about here seems to be, I mean, you've told us a lot about, you know, drinking water and sanitation and so on and so forth, but, you know, they're nothing about water as tea or soup or anything like it. Thank you.
Well, the literature that I talked about towards the beginning of the lecture, if you can remember way back then, was about the genre relating to health advice regarding food and drink. And when they discuss water, invariably they have a short paragraph on boiling, whether this is good or bad. And nobody seems to agree whether it's good or bad. Whether it concentrates the bad stuff in the water, but some people say, well, that's good because then the bad stuff settles to the bottom. So for them, if it settles to the bottom, problem solved. You know, your water's pure. You know, there might be all this gunge at the bottom, but it's fine. But there's no sense, okay, until the bacteriological revolution of the 1860s that you're killing bacteria, right? Nobody's talking about germs. But they're talking in a theoretical way. So these debates don't actually help us understand whether people were drinking boiled, you know, herbal infusions before tea comes along. I mean, I tried to write a history of food using these sources. I couldn't say anything about tea before tea, if you know what I mean. And in fact, one economic historian has hypothesized, well, the arrival of tea prevented people from dying of terrible bacteriological diseases because they were boiling the water and drinking it that way. I'm not really a fan of these sort of kind of reductive explanations, but yeah, it's certainly an interesting hypothesis. So yeah, I can't really answer your question based on the sources I have. Other than we know they were drinking them as medicines. They called them decotti, decoctions of some sort, so presumably they had to be heated. Whether they were boiled, whether they were drunk hot, it doesn't actually, none of the medical texts tell us these things. Because they're infuriating if you actually want to recreate something, and foodies love to do this. They don't give you enough information about how to prepare things, and so you're really kind of making it up as you go along. Yeah, question. I think there's a microphone there.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. You spent a lot of time covering the 1500s, right, in Venice and then in Naples. Would you say that this is the period of time when there is the cultural shift from wine to water as the preferred beverage amongst the masses, or would you pinpoint that shift in another period of time? I'm very interested into knowing when that shift, cultural shift, actually occurred, And what were the causes, principally? Because we know that obviously in the church, wine, right, the Catholic Church always held the wine as the sacred, right, bevanda, right, in the Mass. So I'm very interested to know is when did this shift take place, in your opinion, and why did it take place? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. To be facetious, I'm not sure the shift ever happened. I mean, no, one of the things I was dead set on proving was that people did drink the water. There's sort of assumption that people always preferred wine at any level of society. Now, if you were poor, you drank something like Acquarello or something like a watered down wine or something like that. If you were in beer drinking countries, you drank small beer. And people drank a lot. You know, where people are consuming wine whilst working and they're partly paid in wine, we're talking about 1 liter a day. You know, this is a lot of wine. Now, the water would have been watered. The wine would have been watered, but it's still a lot. The difficulty for us, for me in particular, working from these kind of medical records to get an actual practice is a challenge. The problem with water in particular is it's banal. Nobody writes about water. They write about wine all the time. Even historians, you know, there are probably a half dozen books come out every year on the history of wine. Nobody worked on the history of water except for me. But anyway, so I can't actually say when that happened and if it ever did. But when people are, you know, in different contexts, they are drinking water. They are drinking plain water, you know, whether they're working in the fields or whatever. But I haven't been able to determine in which context they'll be drinking water, which they'll be drinking wine, and so on. But in other words, what I've been trying to do is put water back on the table, really.
So
as
primarily due to the lack of documentation?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you a lot for the talk. It was really wonderful. My question goes in the same vein that Professora Tarocco is. We mainly talk about liquid water, but I would like to know if you find out of the other states of water, if you have some clues, or if you have, for example, you focus a lot in the works. I came to my mind about ice, for example.
Yes, yeah.
So if you have some findings.
No, I mean, ice becomes really fashionable to chill beverages in this period, in the 16th century, and there is a huge medical debate. So in the context where they're debating whether it's good or not to boil water, they debate whether it's good to drink chilled beverages. And the doctors are dead set against it. But one thing you learn pretty quickly reading this stuff is that doctors eventually cave in to what people are doing. So as it becomes popular, someone like Pisanelli, who I cited, he says, well, you know, okay, it's probably best to avoid it, but, you know, it's hot in the summer, and I've seen how it prevents diseases because, you know, fevers and stuff. So eventually he comes around to it. Whereas doctors in Northern Europe, they try to persuade their patients to stay off. You don't want to chill your drinks. No way. That's, you know, it's already cold. We need to be drinking warming things, you know. So it's all about context. But eventually ice houses from the Renaissance onwards are built everywhere in Europe to store ice. So in other words, you know, people will listen, not like us. We listen to the medical advice. Well, I mean, we know what the medical advice is. It doesn't necessarily mean we pay strict attention to it, right? In moderation. I guess that's what doctors would say, everything in moderation.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, first of all, for a brilliant lecture. I think what I wanted to ask has already come up a couple of times in all the questions, but it goes to this use of water for health. All the sources that you mentioned are sort of from the literary or literate classes, but do we have any information on the use of water for the purposes of health by the popular classes? And probably not so much from what I gather. But in that case, my follow-up question would be, do you see any directions in which research could go to recover that knowledge? Do you think there's any storage of text somewhere, somehow? Is it possible to recover this, or is this perfectly lost to history, sadly?
You know, as a historian, if it were there, I would have done it. It's not a facetious answer. I'm serious, you know. I've always, as a historian, been interested in, especially, the popular classes, which we used to call them back in the 90s, and gender issues. And it's something I've not been able to do, whether in my own research, but also in the project more broadly. So Lavinia, for example, the example from Milan, she's able to talk about some of these which are popular occupations in that they're lower class occupations, but the sources, the evidence is still literate. I mean, it's documentation. It's written by the elites. The only way, and this is true of any kind of history, is to read between the lines, is kind of to approach these sources by asking different questions of them. So rather than, say, just summarizing their point of view, you try to get at it from another way. It was, once again, historians talk about reading between the lines or techniques like this, which that requires different kinds of sources. Sometimes iconographic sources can help us, but those too are representations. So in a way, the answer is probably no, or, well, maybe, but probably it's difficult. Yeah, thank you.
Can I just read out a few questions from our audience online? So Sarah Keller from Erfurt University says, thank you for a very clear and inspiring lecture. My question on spaces dedicated to water, such as the monumental fountain you mentioned. Do you also look at the practices connected to such places, rituals, festivals, urban practices, etc.?
Festivals. No, none of us is studying festivals per se. Let me see. I mean, Salvo Valenti sort of, when he looks at the arrival of, so the arrival of piped water, there are, you know, in Venice, for example, they put up a fountain in Piazza San Marco when piped water arrives in 1884 as a kind of inauguration. And so that's something that he's looked at, and I'll look at it too in my book when I eventually write it. But we haven't looked at, say, processions on water,
right?
You know, like the kind of thing they do here to inaugurate Carnival or whatever. Yeah. Just had that a few days ago. Nobody is studying those. I remember in my initial application, all that stuff was there. But it just, at the time of putting together a team, it really reflects our, you know, our own research agendas, our own interests, and it just so happens, there's whole huge gaps. Like I said, another is gender. Yeah. And sort of the celebrations to do with water, festivities to do with water, are not actually being studied by anyone. So yeah, but it's a really nice question.
I think someone should, can you please switch off? Someone online has their phone, Mitsuyo, I think. Hello?
No.
Can you switch
something
off?
About bathing there. I would be interested in learning about the use of water for bathing.
Mitsuyo, can you switch off your phone? Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, in answer to the question about bathing, that's actually, it's not something I'm working on myself, but one of the team members, Andrea Tofolon, who's a PhD candidate, is working on a religious and medical history of thermal springs, mostly in the Veneto, and mostly during the 16th and 17th centuries.
There's also a question about privatization.
Oh.
Matteo Pavesi, the second. Oh, okay. I would be interested to hear more about the political economy of the drinking waters you have been researching. Was public water or water as a commons the standard? Have you encountered much evidence of water privatization?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's something where both my work and that of Salvo kind of overlaps. In Venice, for example, it's mixed because I talked about the public wells, which, as the name suggests, were open to the public. In fact, they were considered a part of poor relief. The wealthier or better off people in Venice would have had their own private wells.
Yeah.
What I didn't say about the wells, and this is very important actually in terms of answering the question, is that they're entirely dependent on rainwater. The problem with rainwater in a Mediterranean or semi-Mediterranean climate like Venice is drought, when it doesn't rain. So during the summer, but also sometimes during the winter, you know, even this winter it hasn't rained very much. And so I've been tracing the activities of the acquaroli. Acquaroli are watermen who go to collect water at the river Brenta. There's a canalization of the river Brenta. They bring it by boat back to Venice. It's about a 3 or 4 hour trip. And then they pour the water, not into the wells, but into the holes around the paving. Yeah, I don't know if I can go, no, never mind. Anyway, the point is when they pour the water in, the river water in, it goes through the sand filter and then deposits. So it gets filtered as well. The acquaroli have an obligation to deliver 100 boatloads, and they're big boats, the burchi, boatloads to the public wells every year. Individuals can pay for it. So that's where the private aspect comes in. If your well, you know, in your house, in your courtyard is going dry, you know, you phone up the acquaroli, say, can you bring us a load of water? And you know, I know how much that costs. For private people, there's a certain cost. For monasteries and convents, there's another cost. It's a reduced tariff. For the arsenale, they pay much less. That sort of thing. So there is public and there is also private. And I think in most cities in Europe in this period, so up until the 19th century, you'll find this mixture. A sense that, yes, water is a public good, but if you want privileged access, you pay for that. So in Naples, Negrone talks about the water concessions that I mentioned. Those are your own pipes to your own supply, your own kitchen or whatever, which you pay for according to the diameter of the pipe. Yeah, so that's an example of the mixture of the two.
Sure, thank you. Hi, thank you for the conference. It was very interesting, and it brought me to think about how would you connect, based on this historical perspective of the treatment of water in Venice, how would you connect this to contemporary questions on the importation of water or the sewage system present in Venice, and more general issues on pollution within the lagoon? I was interested in your insights on that.
No, thank you. Yes, no, it's something we're interested in. In fact, Salvo and I are editing a volume on I wanted to call it shit. I'm not sure if the publisher's going to let us, but on sanitation anyway. And Venice is always a great case study. I mean, not that Venice is unique. I wouldn't want, well, it is unique, but from a point of view of sort of water supply and sanitation, what is really helpful about Venice from a scholarship point of view is how everything in Venice, because of this special man-made environment, well, mixture of human and environmental, is the way everything is evident, everything is out in the open, the way the rubbish is taken away every day. You know, in most of our cities, we're not really aware of that. And this is true historically as well. It means there's a lot of good documentation about things like, in my case, water supply, in Salvo's case, especially sanitation. So the issues are different in the early modern and late modern past compared to today. I mean, first of all, the human waste for us is a problem. In the early modern period, it was a resource, it was fertilizer. So it was about how to collect it, how to get it out of the city. Now, in the case of Venice, it's taken by boat out to, you know, the islands where they're cultivating things like Sant'Erasmo, or it's taken along the coast to be put on fields. In theory, the canals, if you lived in a building along the canal, your latrine, it's called the necessaria, which is a great euphemism, your latrine was meant to drain directly into the canal. So when the canal was at high tide, it would kind of flush this stuff out and then take it out to sea. That was a theory. In the practice, it never worked so efficiently, especially when the water was low for days on end. You can imagine the smell. But this kind of, tide every 6 hours, in theory, you know, it makes Venice probably amongst the cleanest cities, or at least I've argued anyway, the cleanest cities in Europe at the time, because most cities you're just dumping the waste in a corner somewhere, and then it will be collected periodically. But, you know, in between collections, anyway. So the issues are different and not different at the same time. What is consistent is the way historians have studied freshwater provision and human waste removal as two sides of the same coin. Because if you don't deal with the human waste properly, it will ruin your freshwater supply and so on. So these are perennial issues. I know I haven't answered your question. I really live in the past, so I'm not so good.
No, I think she's also trying
But other than living in Venice, you know, as I do, one's aware of the delicate balance that there is. But I think that balance exists everywhere. It's just that here we're so much aware of it, you know?
I guess, and that goes also with the question we have online. This is any evidence on early uses. Kate Ginevra says, any evidence on early uses of divination, dowsing to find pure water?
Oh yes, dowsing, yes. Negrone has an essay on that. I think for us it's a bit mysterious, or at least it has that kind of aura about it, because for us it doesn't fit in with our notions of science.
Right.
But for someone like Negrone, that's not a problem, because their notions of science are different. So it's entirely consistent. You would expect the Earth to be sending you signals. So yes, very much. He has all kinds of techniques for divining where water is.
Right.
Yeah.
Erasmo.
Thank you, David, for presenting us your work. And I was wondering, you were introducing or explaining, you know, in your application why Italy was a good place to start with this analysis. And, you know, there was not just the natural diversity that you have in the Italian peninsula, but also how divided it was politically, and therefore you can see different not only cultural behavior, but also political behavior towards the use of water. Yeah. You mentioned also in Lavinia's work with state project of cultivating rice in the mainland of the Venetian state. I was wondering if you have noticed a shift, a political shift in a certain time where states start to deal with the issue of water, and so try to control, regulate that. And the other thing is if you manage to, comparing different systems, if you notice some particular issues related to that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something we've thought about. Remember, I flipped through it very quickly. There was that slide, that kind of timeline. There's a cluster of things that happen in the early 1500s. It may be because I'm an early modernist, and that's when we start. We're sort of trained to think of this being, it's not as if somebody woke up, on the 1st of January 1500 and thought, oh, wow, I'm in the early modern period. It's great to have the Middle Ages behind me. I mean, it's not like that, but there's a whole succession of things going on, let's say within the first few decades of that century, that tell us we're in a different world, or at least things are. Whether this has to do with the Protestant Catholic Reformations, the civilizing society, there's all kinds of things that come together to make for increased regulation. Magistrato alle Acque, founded in 1501, that's a perfect thing. But my health officers, the Provveditori alla Sanità, they exist from before then. But all of a sudden, they get all this legislation that's being issued in the first few decades regarding water, but all kinds of other things, plague and so on. And then we have all kinds of infrastructure activities going on, building new irrigation schemes. Even if we simply catalog, as Berviglieri has done, the patents submitted to the Venetian Senate for various inventions and so on, it just takes off. So it's clear something is happening. Yeah, so that's why for us it works, or at least, well, it worked in the application and got me the grant, I don't know. The problem is the end. When do we end? That's the really tough one. Because normally, early modernists, well, it depends. If you're American, you might stop in the 1650s. If you're British early modernist, you stop in 1800. But none of them have anything to do with water. Yeah? So as a medical historian, I used to think, well, when do I stop? The bacteriological revolution, so Pasteur and all that, 1860s. That's when things change medically. The previous, 1,500 years, you could study it as one period, really. So when do things start to change? I asked myself, well, yes, it's in the 19th century. So forget being an early modernist. The interesting cutoff date starts to be with the arrival of Asiatic cholera in the 1830s in Europe, then successive epidemics. That's when cities start to think, oh my God, we have to completely redo our water supply, our sanitation. So most cities in Europe have done that by the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. Well, they still keep getting cholera epidemics, even though, despite that, but they think they're combating the problem. And the result of cholera means people for the first time make a link between water and disease. Believe it or not, before then, they're not making a direct link. So certain waters, if you drink too much of them, can cause certain illnesses, but they're not making direct correlations between, say, drinking water and dysentery, fevers. They talk about miasmas, so that's the exhalations coming off a body of water, not consuming this stuff. And it's only with cholera that there's this direct, immediate, and, well, not so direct. It takes at least until the middle of the 19th century before they even start to make this correlation. Anyway, that seemed a point at which to cut it off. And in answer to the second part of the question, I sort of tried to answer that. I tried to, in my work, tried to look at, when it comes to managing urban water resources or fresh water resources, does it work different in Venice, where it's a republic, or an aristocratic republic at least, compared to, say, a kingdom like Naples, or a theocracy like the Papal States. And I think it does, because when the popes sort of redo the hydraulic system, so they're reinventing the Aqua Virgo or whatever, and it becomes the Aqua Vergine, yeah. Basically from the 1620s onwards. So restoring some ancient aqueducts, but also building new ones. When that's done and they start building fountains and making the water accessible, it's something the popes bestow on people. It's like patronage or gift giving. So you are in their debt in a way. Compare that to the Venetian system, where you have 150 public wells for the use of the poor. Now, all those wells have the Lion of St. Mark on them. So, I mean, when Napoleon came, or was it the Austrians? I don't know, they chiseled off the lions, but never mind that. They all had them once, and so that reminded you who is bestowing, but it was available to everyone, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. It was, I'm sure you had to queue up, and you could only take your bucket load and all that, but it was there. And the resource is managed by different bodies, and that's typical of Venice. There are 3 different bodies who share jurisdiction over the management of the wells. So that's meant to prevent it from going into the hands of one body and corruption and all that. There's corruption anyway, but that's another story. And then, Naples is a bit different again, because it's a viceroy. It's a monarchy, but ruled at a distance. The nobles are powerful, so there are places where anybody can get the water, but once again, private individuals pay for concessions. It's managed by the city, but the viceroy tries to take control. So once again, it's typical of the tussle in Naples between the local and the Spanish elites. So there is some difference in the way water resources are managed according to the political entity.
So I think on this wonderful line of the beauties of the commons, I think thank you so much, David. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to people online. Good night. Bye-bye. Ciao.